I love the feeling of unity that a great city like New York brings me. I love to walk down the streets and see the different cultures, human beings of all sizes and shapes, styles and colors, sharing the same place and many of the same desires. In a place like this, I also love to compare the people I see with myself. Their lives are interesting. Some are strange, some are very attractive. I love the food of many cultures. I love to hear their music and their languages, observe their dress and movements, and witness how they worship. In my work as a scholar, I imagine moving from the detail of the many particularities of the city street up to the top floor of a great skyscraper, from where I can see down, as if from a bird's eye view, the patterns of human living. It was great to go to the top of the Empire State Building, but I'll do the rest of the talk from here in my living room. From on high, we can see the structures. We can see the patterns of human life. And that allows us also to compare them, to see one and another together in one gaze, and then make some judgment about them. It's true that comparativism has been criticized heavily. For example, there are groups who see in the comparativist approach a colonialistic or imperialistic tendency. There's the issue of platonizing categories that are seen as being abstract. There are those who apply a Foucauldian critique and say that actually the groups that we compare are engaged in a power struggle, and that to compare is to choose one side of that struggle. Now, perhaps because of the ugliness of that idea and that power struggle, there are other scholars who tend to emphasize a more peaceful, Irenic approach, where we look at cultures only in their own terms and don't try to compare them one with another. So I'd like to unabashedly propose today a comparative approach. And in that, I am comforted by the recent work by Corinne Dempsey on comparative religions, where she says that although she didn't set out to write a book about comparative religions, in her studies, looking at different cultures, she realized she had to compare them in order to understand them. She had to compare them in order to translate their words and their experiences into her own words and her own experiences. So the very act of knowing itself imposes categories on experience. So then the real issue becomes, if we're going to compare things, where is the invariant core that we are comparing? And that is what I'd like to talk about today. When we try to use words as the invariant, or categories such as religion or God, we all know how fraught those categories are. They don't really work as a basis for comparison. I would like to instead propose a structural comparison. So let's talk now about divination. According to Buccellati, divination arose in Mesopotamia essentially along the lines of looking for regularities in the natural world. So astronomy is one example of this. You watch the planets and the stars night after night for many years, you start to realize that there are regularities in their behavior. Now that's an interesting intellectual experience. You have to observe, first of all, for a long period of time, and you also have to make detailed notes. And at first, you don't know what direction, what pattern will emerge from all of those observations. So there's first of all a stance of observation that's somewhat similar to modern science in the Mesopotamians. The Shumaizbu is where we see binary oppositions between observation and consequence. So if this happens, then that will happen. And we see that both in the general divination tables as well as in the more specific ones about hepatoscopy and leikonomancy. There's an expectation that the world is orderly. And the art of the diviner was to watch for those regularities, catalog them, write them down, and connect them with their consequences. Now there's a funny example that I'll make reference to later on in one of my drawings that I'll show you. A pig was born with 8 legs and 2 tails, and this was a very strange thing for the farmer whose pig it was. So he sent for the diviner. The diviner came, saw the case, wrote it down. We even have the tablet. The diviner was able to compare this event with past events of the same sort. So the very strange natural event is actually brought back within the realm of the knowable, the known, and we can imagine that the farmer was much less anxious after seeing that. So Mesopotamian divination, according to Buccellati, takes this form of observation and correlation that allows for unexpected events to actually be seen as part of the plan, part of the order of being. The prophet, unlike the diviner, feels himself to be inhabited by a divine voice. He has heard something and he's been asked to say it to the people. And this message has characteristics that are quite different from those of the diviner. One difference, for example, is that the prophet is not a man of the institutions. He acts as a person who is a messenger of the absolute, and he has something to say which is absolutely important, and which no one, not the king, not the priests, no one can impede him from saying. This again is Bucciolati's comparison in a very short summary form. Now, when I started studying this topic, I thought it would be interesting if this structural comparison could be carried out in a graphical form. So I tried to make two drawings that would show these two different experiences. So here's the drawing that I did of divination. You can see that I've represented the divine world as a sort of a black box. We can't really see what's happening inside of it, but we see its effects. And one of the major effects that the divine world has is the natural world. So something unexpected happens. We have this lovely little drawing of a girl walking a pig, which was surprisingly enough drawn for me by a Muslim graphic artist in Bangladesh. The natural world is caused by the divine world, but the events in the natural world affect the humans. So you can see that there are two lines affecting the clients, affecting the diviner. The clients are scared by the event of the pig. They don't know what to do, so they go and ask the diviner for information. What can we do with this? What does this mean? The diviner has one step ahead of them. He's also observing the natural world and collating it and referencing the tables of what has happened in the past. And through those writings, in particular the Shumaizbu, he is able to ask the gods, ask the divine world for things to go the right way for him and so forth, which he does on behalf of the clients. Now, in the biblical world, the situation is a great deal simpler in the drawing. We have God on high, who has a name and who is very specific, who is singular, and who speaks directly to a single person, a single prophet. That prophet then speaks to the people, speaks to the institutions, the priests, the king, and the people in general. In this speaking relationship, God also creates, and this creation of the world is presupposed by the prophets. As we can see from these two drawings, the structure of the experience is quite different. When I first made these drawings, I thought they were very tantalizing. Perhaps if I could summarize a summary in a couple of simple lines, it would be possible to go even further and summarize the actual texts of Mesopotamia in some kind of manner. So I started trying to find a way to build a directed graph representation of these experiences. I settled on the Shuila prayers and the Psalms as the two corpora that I could compare most usefully and most easily. The Shuila prayers, as is well known, are similar to the Psalms in structure and style and intent. Basically what I did is I wrote them in a programming language called Cypher, which is used by Neo4j. I'll show you. So the first step in that coding process meant that I had to create the different categories that were going to be in the graph. So I got to be a creator of gods for a day and create the gods. Then I go down a few lines, create the humans, create the events, and then create the relations between them. So you can see that this particular human is fearing an eclipse, this particular human is asking the god for help, and so forth. So I coded 4 Shuila Psalms. All 4 of them were focused on the evil of a lunar eclipse. Now, once I've put all that into the system and run the command, and the system contains it, then I can visualize it, like so. Now, this is kind of complicated at first, so let me move around the pieces so that you can focus first on the Mesopotamian relations. Here we have at the center in green the lunar eclipse, and then the relations of fear to several persons, and then their relations to the gods. So this schematic drawing is now based directly on the text. I can do the same thing now with the Psalms, and we can look at the drawing that emerges from that code. And you can see at the center of the relations is Yahweh, and he is referenced by the psalmist and the other humans and some of the natural events. Now, if we move to a different visualization that's a little bit simpler and more schematic, we don't see the nature of each of those connections anymore as we did before, but we can see the structure more clearly. So I'm going to move around the pieces so that the gods are on high in the way that the drawing was at the beginning. So at the top we have the gods. On the right-hand side I'm going to put the humans, and on the left-hand side the natural events or spaces. So I'll do that quickly. And what you see now is that the Mesopotamian and the biblical experiences, first of all, they inhabit the same space. I didn't create two separate graphs on purpose. All I did was encode the names of the different characters playing out in the Psalms and in the Shwila prayers, and their relations with each other. So it isn't by design that they are two separate universes, but they come out that way. The next thing we notice is that there's a very large pantheon already forming after 4 prayers on the Mesopotamian side. On the biblical side, there's one God. In the humans, we see similar collections. There's a small group of humans referenced in both drawings, and 1 or 2 natural events or spaces that are relevant to the prayers in question. But the structure is quite different between the two. This comparison was done only between 4 Shwila prayers and 4 psalms. It's a very small corpus, and so my conclusions have to be taken with more than a grain of salt. But what I hope to have shown with this demonstration is that it is possible to build up the structure of religious experience as a directed graph, encode that in the software that can visualize it, and then by that visualization operate a direct comparison between 2 experiences that is value-free. There is no judgment here about which civilization is more interesting or better or more human, more valuable. This is entirely about comparing the structure of the 2 religious experiences. In my view, comparison is necessary in order to know, and although every representation is a simplification, every map is an impoverishment of the reality that it offers us, it also is helpful. It is also helpful to guide us toward a greater understanding of that reality. And in this case, I think that the topological representation of religious experiences, this network structure representation, can help us to see differences on a much simpler and serene level than other kinds of comparison have been able to do in the past. So why don't we finish on the New York City streets with the sunset? In conclusion, I'd like to suggest that we come back down to ground level. We've looked at the details, the atoms of meaning that can be taken out of the ancient texts, the nodes and edges that link humans and the divine and natural events. But this is like a skeleton without flesh. On the street, in the details, we can again perceive not only the structure, but the heart. Like the sycamores on a New York neighborhood street, we have different shapes. We've had different experiences. We all share the same space, and we reach from the ground toward the sky, searching for the light.